We heard an Israeli official earlier this week say that for every 2 civilians that are killed, there's 1 Hamas militant that's killed. And so that is a pretty significant number, especially when we're talking about, the number they've given this week is about 15,000 deaths. So we're talking 5,000 Hamas fighters and 10,000 civilians that have been killed. So the numbers are pretty staggering.
Right.
That being said, the 5,000 Hamas fighters is still only, a fraction of the roughly 30,000 strong military that they have in Gaza.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, what's the situation with the fighting in Gaza right now?
Great question. So at this exact moment, Israel is primarily conducting operations in the southern part of Gaza, where they say the Hamas leaders are currently holed up. And so they are conducting operations. They're facing some resistance in the south, and they're also conducting some but fewer operations in the north, having already conducted operations in that part prior to the ceasefire. And so at this exact moment, we're seeing still a continued pretty strong air presence from the Israeli Air Force. We're seeing significant amounts of destruction. We're seeing, a continually rising death toll, which has been obviously a source of contention among Gazans, Israelis, and the international community.
Right.
And while you can't debate the overwhelming death toll, the significant destruction that's going on in Gaza, there are questions about or disputes between who's dying, how many combatants, how many civilians. We heard an Israeli official earlier this week say that for every 2 civilians that are killed, there's 1 Hamas militant that's killed. And so that is a pretty significant number, especially when we're talking about, the number they've given this week is about 15,000 deaths. So we're talking 5,000 Hamas fighters and 10,000 civilians that have been killed. So the numbers are pretty staggering.
Right.
That being said, the 5,000 Hamas fighters is still only, a fraction of the roughly 30,000 strong military that they have in Gaza. So even though we're seeing such significant destruction, the toll the campaign is taking, there are questions about, how much of Hamas Israel's taken out to date.
And these casualties sort of raise tensions in the international community and kind of test the level of international support that Israel can continue to receive for this campaign.
That's exactly right. We've seen in the 2 months since this war broke out, the conflict has been very similar to previous iterations of fighting between Israel and Hamas, however on a much larger scale. And so we've known throughout previous iterations of this conflict that Hamas embeds itself within civilian communities, both within and underneath them in a significant tunnel infrastructure that they've spent years building up. And so what Hamas does is they will often fire rockets from these residential areas, these generally protected areas from military. They're not military targets. And so Israel is then put in a position where if they want to respond to these attacks, they have to go into civilian communities or potentially, take that calculation into account and potentially harm civilians in their efforts to get Hamas militants. And so now we're seeing this on a much larger scale. We've seen more Palestinians die during this conflict than we've seen in previous iterations by a pretty significant margin. And so as you mentioned, Israel is facing a significant amount of scrutiny from the UN, from a number of Arab countries, and also other countries. We've seen some criticism from G7 countries, all of whom say Israel needs to ensure the safety of civilians. Now, that's very tough considering we're talking about Gaza, which is pretty close to the size of New Jersey.
Right.
We're talking about a much more densely populated area than New Jersey, and Israel has already pushed more than 1 million people from the north to the south. So now the south is heavily concentrated, even more than usual, and it's where Israel is conducting its, this part of its military operation. So there are significant concerns, even reiterated as recently as this week by U.S. officials, that Israel needs to continue to not only protect civilian lives, but do more to prevent civilian casualties.
We've been talking for a while about the possibility of Russian war crimes and investigations that are happening internationally to determine whether war crimes have been committed in Ukraine. But we've now seen some of this a little closer to home.
There was a pretty significant announcement this week from the Department of Justice, which came out and announced that 4 Russian military officers, 2 of whom were unit leaders, were charged in U.S. court for carrying out war crimes against an American citizen. Mm-hmm. And so in this case, which is laid out in court documents, these 4 Russian soldiers abducted and kidnapped an American that was living in Ukraine but was not fighting. So this was not an American that was fighting on the front lines. This was a civilian who was an American Ukrainian who lived in Ukraine at the time. Mm-hmm. He was kidnapped. He was held for about 10 days. He was tortured. He was threatened. He was threatened with being executed. They even fired a gun near his head to, give him the he thought he was going to die in this moment. Mm-hmm. And so the DOJ announced that these 4 individuals were charged under this never used before law that's been in effect for about 30 years now, but it allows the U.S. to file charges against non-Americans who commit war crimes against Americans. And so in this announcement, the DOJ also announced that they were reviewing the October 7th attack that Hamas carried out in Israel, potentially under these same laws. And so in that instance, in the October 7th attack, we saw more than 30 Americans who were killed. Right. And there's still believed to be about 9 to 10 Americans still held in Gaza now 2 months after the fact. And so that we have no new information about any potential charges towards specific members of Hamas or Hamas leadership.
But we could see that.
Exactly. It was telling that this was, there was an implication that this was on the table, and mm-hmm. it was unclear before this press conference that was the case.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.